Good morning, and welcome to the Scientific Revolution 13.3 notes. So we got a lot going on here today. We're going to talk a little bit first about some scientists and some things going on, but this is a continuation, kind of runs in tandem with what was happening with everything else at the same time. We're actually going to talk about some of the same scientists, but in a different context. I promised earlier that we'd talk about Galileo, so we're going to definitely talk about Galileo a little bit more today. But we're going to start with Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon lived in the late early 1600s, and he was one of the fathers of what we refer today as the scientific method. And one of the big reasons he did it, he had three things that he did very clearly, and it was very important to him. Number one, he observed the world around him. And it was that same idea of saying, if I observe the world around, I can see what is true. Okay? And so not only did he observe the world around him, he also started to carry out some experiments. Now, he wasn't the first guy. Matter of fact, a lot of the things that he learned were from reading other scientists and other philosophers' ideas, and that kind of comes back around a very important part of the scientific method. He did a lot of reading, and in all of that reading he found that the reason and the observation of the world were the best ways to come up with truth. And so he had experiments, and then after he did experiments, he came up with theories to try to explain the natural world. Okay? Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about Francis Bacon and the church, but you need to know that Francis Bacon really was very big when it came to the church. He actually said, his quotation was that nature was a rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator, that the world was a place that God showcased his best work. So that concept of Francis Bacon was, closely tied to the church and actually held a position within the church, the Roman Catholic Church. So those were Francis Bacon's ideas. Now, a little bit later, just about a few years later, at the beginning of the 1600s, so Bacon and René Descartes kind of overlapped. And those two men are considered really the fathers of what we would consider modern scientific method. Now, Descartes said you doubt everything. And remember that whole idea of faith? Forget about faith, you doubt everything. Matter of fact, there's only one thing you don't doubt, and that was a Latin phrase which was cogito ergo sum. Now, cognition, thought, all right, was the root of that, and saying cogito ergo sum. Ergo is therefore. So I think, therefore I am. Sum, I exist. So Descartes said, René Descartes believed that the only thing you can take for granted is the understanding of I exist because I think, because I reason, I'm here. So that's the only thing. Everything else, you have to question everything else that happens. So he doubted everything. He believed that the natural world was a machine. It ran like a machine. It had rules and order. Newton was one of the ones who later took this and wrote them down, his laws of how the machine ran, of how nature ran. But Descartes was one of the first to say, nature is like a machine, and it runs on specific rules. Okay, so they're his big things. Remember that cogito ergo sum is I think, therefore I am. I have reason, therefore I exist, and that is the one given. So the two of them, using these things, come together and develop what is not together, but they are the fathers of what we consider today the scientific method. Now, the scientific method has principles, rules, steps that it follows. And of course, taking Francis Bacon and Descartes, we come back to number one is to state a problem, the why. Why does an apple fall? Why does the earth seem to spin? Why do the planets move in an ellipses? And after we ask the why, we find a problem, then we take it and we gather information. Now, this can be through reading, which is, again, Francis Bacon did a lot of reading, or it can be through observation of the natural world. So you gather information, that's your step 2. Number 3 is you form a hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis is different than a theory, and these things are kind of often linked together. But a hypothesis is an untested possible solution. So we gather some information, we observe some things, and we come up with a hypothesis. So the hypothesis is a possible solution or an answer that has not yet been tested. Important thing to understand for science, that's where hypothesis differs from theory. So hypothesis then needs to be tested. So that was the experiment part, where we carry out an experiment which is repeatable, which has specific rules that have kind of developed over time, having controls, being repeatable, all of those things. So after we experiment, hugely we record. We write down what we've learned, not only for ourselves, but for future scientists. We make observations, we record what we've done. After we record it, we analyze it. And after analyzing and looking at all the data, our 6th step, final step, is we draw conclusions. Well, it's never a final step. We draw conclusions, we may make modifications, and after we draw our conclusions, then we can come up with a scientific theory. Now, if a scientific theory is proven repeatedly, just over and over again, every time I take an apple and drop it, it falls. Every time I take an apple, I drop it, it falls. That becomes a law. And so we stop calling them theories. We have lots of theories. We have the theory of plate tectonics. We have the theory of evolution. We have lots of theories that have been tested, have been observed, experiments have been performed, but we don't have them yet as laws. Laws are those things that are absolute, that we accept in the scientific community as, okay? So we understand that hypothesis is untested, theory is tested, law is proven. Okay, so that's where we get those 3. Now, these 2 men, along with several others, take this idea of reason and we start to apply it to government, and we start to apply it to economics, and we start to say, if we observe the problems in the world, we can come up with solutions. And this is where we start to say, how do we address poverty? How do we address the inequity in society of, we have a lot of poor people who struggle, and they seem to work hard, but they don't seem to make much. And then we have the very rich who seem to be indolent, and they don't work. And so there were different solutions for this. Obviously, up to this point, we'd had the monarchy, with it, like the single ruler, or the empire, the emperor, who is the single ruler. And we start looking at things like democracies, republics. We even look at things like communism, where we say, okay, take everything in common. And so that idea. As far as money, we've talked different ways of financial ideas, of saying that we have capitalism, a free market society, where someone says, I have something, I want to sell it, and if it's rare or if it's necessary, it's worth more. And so we can do fair trade, and we go back and forth. And some people say there's problems with that, we should just do socialism, where everyone throws everything into a big pot and we take what we need. Okay? And then you can even go further and look at things like anarchy, which says we don't want any authority at all. No one is going to tell us what to do. No authority. This translates a little bit into things like libertarianism, which people believe they have their liberties, their freedoms, and that trumps everything else. It's more important than anything else in the world is that liberty, that freedom to do what they want to do, so long as, we've talked about this, it doesn't infringe on somebody else's liberties. Okay, different forms of government, monarchies, democracies where everyone has an equal say, a republic where we have representatives, and we've talked about having a democratic republic, that our republic, we vote for not everything, we vote for people who then look after our best interests. Hopefully, that's supposed to be how it works. And again, communism, which would be saying that everyone has everything in common, everyone has equality, we all get the same thing, And there are problems with all these forms of government. As a matter of fact, the United States was referred to and is often still referred to as the Great Experiment. This democratic republic is saying that, wow, is this thing really going to work? We're taking this hybrid of these multiple government types, and does this work? So we take a democratic republic and run it on capitalist ideas, saying that free market, you buy what you want, and I buy what I want, and if you have something that I deem to be more valuable, I'm going to pay you more. Is it perfect? No, but does it grant a significant amount of liberty? Yes. Do we make stupid decisions? Absolutely. Because we value things differently. And instead of saying we value, maybe something more, we value healthcare for ourselves, but do we value healthcare for everyone? Well, no, we don't. Otherwise, we would be in a different boat. We value entertainment probably more than anything. Obviously, that's where we spend our money. We spend our money on sporting events and movies and music, and those are the highest paid people in society right now, which kind of tells you where our values lie. And so that is all based on this free market that we live in today. And it was based on that idea of humanities, that if we study humans and see how they've reacted in the past and see how they react in the present, we can understand them. So these guys all believed that humans were part of this natural machine that had rules and laws, and we could predict it. But it threw it off, but it also opened a brand new realm of study called humanities. This study of human nature and different sciences. So we have psychology, psychiatry, sociology, archaeology, studying people of the past, and all of these different studies of people and trying to make people fit into this natural world. And of course, you can imagine it made people insane trying to figure out every human's going to do this every time, and they don't. You drop an apple on a guy's head, he's not going to have the same reaction as the guy sitting next to him, as the guy sitting next to him, as the guy. They've tried to find some universal things, but it's the great mystery. It's one of the great mysteries. I would say, the great mysteries being God and human nature, that we've still tried to figure that out. All right. So how does this affect religion? Well, I've already told you that a lot of the great scientists were very religious. But it created conflicts, especially with the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church had the idea at the time, and it was a valid argument, is that if you say one thing we do is wrong, then you can dismiss the entire thing. And it created problems. So as people like Galileo Galilei shows up, and he says, listen, I know you're really keyed into this idea of the Earth being the center of the solar system. I mean, you read about it in Psalms, you read about it in Chronicles in the Bible, and so it should tell us that, the world is perfect creation of God, and that the Earth is the center, and that's how it should be. And so do we mean centric as in physical center, or do we mean centric as in the emotional center? Starts to create some philosophical questions. But the Roman Catholic Church at the time couldn't let it go. Now you have to recognize, please recognize that we're having this Protestant Reformation. We're having outside attacks by the Muslim world is growing and getting bigger. We've failed in recapturing the Holy Land during the Crusades. All of these things compound to make the Roman Catholic Church kind of put up the barriers and say, no, we're going to draw a line in the sand. This is where we're drawing our line. Sadly, it was the wrong line to draw, because they could be proven wrong, which they ended up being proven wrong. So we couldn't have ideas. So there are two complaints where you couldn't have ideas that contradicted the church's teachings. And number two, we were worried about infallibility, that if we say something, it has to be true. If it's in the Bible, it must be true, verbatim true. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And so if I say, according to the Bible, the Earth is X number of years old, carbon dating proves me wrong, well, we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We say, everything, and the Catholics were worried that everything would get thrown out. If you disproved one thing, everything is now open to interpretation. We get to pitch it all. Not necessarily true, but it was a concern. So those are their two major complaints. This led them to try Galileo, because remember that Galileo, he wrote, not the first one to write, the Tycho, we talked about Tycho being, but Galileo wrote a book called Sidereus Nuncius, in which book he said the sun is the center of the universe, not understanding solar systems and all of that, but to our understanding at the time, the sun is the center of the universe, not the earth. And the Catholic Church said, take it back. And he said, no. And he said, the earth moves, the stars move, we all move around the sun. And they said, on pain of torture, take it back. And so, under pain of torture, basically holding, the gun to the head and saying, do it or else. And he did. He said, okay, I take it back. I take it back. And famously, it's a kind of apocryphal a little bit, but they said as he walked out of the trial, he says, and yet it moves. You can make me take it back, but it's moving. It's all moving. And it's all moving in ellipses. And there's big spots in the sun. And the moon has craters and pits. It's not perfect as you think. But again, Galileo was a strong Catholic. He truly believed that science did not deny God. Science, again, showed the existence of God and how great he was. And we just use science to understand the things that God created. Okay? Copernicus was a church official. He obviously wasn't anti-church. He was a church official. Newton, he saw a communion, a combination between science and religion. He said they played off of each other. Now, Francis Bacon, I said, really believed, but he also said you can't mix them. That was Bacon's big thing, is he said you can't mix the two. Don't try to use science to explain religion. It's ineffable, meaning it's indescribable. They're the mysteries of God, and we call them mysteries of God for a reason. And so Bacon said, also, don't try to use religion to explain science. Because again, it comes back to that concept of saying, if I can't observe it, I can't call it a natural law. Okay? So that's kind of where we are right there. And that leaves us in this position of saying the scientists were at odds with the Catholic Church for years and years and years. We wish that all of these men who were strong Catholics and scientists were able to get along, but in some regards, the Roman Catholic Church dug in their heels and set the Inquisition loose. And so the Inquisition was the group that went after Galileo. And you have to remember, the most famous of the Inquisitions was the Spanish Inquisition, but the Inquisition was actually that group within the church who went after those who were in opposition to the church, and the belief that Galileo was in opposition to the church. Okay, so that's where we are, and that should set you up pretty well for tomorrow's quiz on 13.3. And then we have I think it's a fun project, but you guys are going to make an Instagram page on a scientific revolution. Actually, I'm going to give you everything. Any of the any of the scientific revolution, Renaissance, and this all kind of clumps under the Renaissance. Any of those Renaissance figures would include scientists, painters, artists. You get to do an Instagram profile and page as though you were that artist. Okay? All right, my friends, there's your lecture for the day. You can watch it tomorrow. Quiz is going to be on Thursday. Have a great day. We'll talk to you later.